Welcome to Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair. Resilience is all about making a choice when the unexpected hits you so that you can move forward. Unlocked is about opening possibilities for that choice so that when you are hit with the unexpected, you can move on. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of authentic self and beyond, especially when we are called upon to convey our ideas. Presentation is one of those times. I've been asked to help presenters become better. I'd like to tell you about one such time, which I think will relate to the topic of today's show. In this case, I was working with top economists who were presenting in an annual event of global leaders. The previous year, although they are considered top in development economics, they had received the lowest score among the many expert groups who had been presenting. They wanted to improve their game and their scores. Remember, these are economists who love numbers. Now, there were about 15 of them, and I was given 2 days to do whatever I could to help them. I decided that the best way to address their challenge was to work with each individual on a one-by-one basis. Now, in that way, I could focus my attention to the one thing I thought I could affect in such a small amount of time. Now, keep in mind, they were world-renowned. They were true experts. They really wanted to succeed, and they were presenting complex information that required that they be attentive to their own content. And I had 1 hour to help each one. I decided to ask each economist what they wished to accomplish through their talk. But I didn't ask this once. I asked it as many times as was needed to get them to say something that they could see at the time that indicated the audience was engaged. It was different for each of them. To give you a feel for this, one might want to see the audience ask 3 questions at the end. Once I knew what the objective was, I offered one strategy that would help them achieve that objective. Now, for example, in that case where the economist wanted to receive at least 3 questions from the audience, I suggested that he begin his Q&A by asking the audience a question. Now you might ask, why only one strategy? Well, if you've ever given a presentation to an important audience, you know that all of your attention is consumed. You can't try to think of 3 new things at the same time, but you usually can think of one. What were the results? That year, the economists were ranked as the #1 group. I sometimes think I was lucky, although I knew why I had decided to do what I did. Would that work in every case? Are there other things that could have been done that would have had the same effect? Was it merely that the economists were given support for the first time, making them feel cared for and important? By the way, that's sometimes called the Hawthorne effect. Today, I'm looking forward to hearing from someone who has helped many people present themselves better, and maybe his perspective on why my strategy appeared to have worked. My guest today is Matt Kohut. Matt Kohut is the managing partner of KNP Communications. He has coached CEOs, elected officials, and public figures for events from live national television appearances to TED Talks. He's the co-author of Compelling People, the hidden qualities that make us influential. Matt, welcome to Unlocked.
Thanks, Madelyn. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, great. Well, I love it, the fact that you come in as an expert. I mean, a pretty heavy-duty expert, in fact. I was wondering if you could tell the audience something about yourself that would help them see that, yes, you have expertise, but you're also a human being. Like, Well, I won't even give you suggestions. I'll let you
Sure.
think about that.
Well, I think the thing that might put that in context is that nobody starts their life as, say, a college student thinks, and oh, I'm going to be a person who helps people become better speakers. It's not a career path that most people are thinking about when they're 18. And I had several careers before I arrived where I am today. And those included being a professional musician, professional touring and recording musician for a period of about 7 years as a full-time pursuit. And prior to that, I trained as a Montessori elementary school teacher. So I did a lot of different things that informed my background and put me on the path to where I am now. And when I say it like that, it sounds a little bit like I was a dilettante. I happen to think that in some way I was very fortunate to have all these opportunities, of course. But I also think that the kind of work I do is benefited by having a broad range of experiences and a lot of different contexts in which I've learned different things.
I couldn't agree with you more. Just appreciating that life is different for different people is, to me, the first place that I have to remind myself whenever I'm working with a new individual. And I love the fact that you're a Montessori or had been a Montessori teacher. I think our children would so benefit from more of that kind of philosophy, I'll call it. Well, I wonder if we could just then get into this. I think that oftentimes when we think of presenting ourselves, we think of ourselves being on a stage. Well, maybe today we think of ourselves as being in a big Zoom room. But that's not the only area. Why don't you talk about from your perspective, where does presentation occur?
I love that question because I think there's been a real sea change in our lifetime around this idea of how people present themselves. And one way to capture that is we've gone from a culture of oration to a culture of conversation. Mm-hmm. So think about the most popular TED Talks. Go search on TED Talks that have 10 million plus views, for instance. And the speakers are always trying to be as conversational as possible. They are the opposite of somebody coming down from the mountaintop with the stone tablets and orating in some sort of a more formal way. If you look at political speech from the 1930s or the 1950s, you watch old newsreels of presidents or top leaders from around the world or the corporate sector, there was much more of a formal oration style. And I think we've increasingly seen an emphasis on conversational style. And really over the past 2 years, with us going increasingly, almost overwhelmingly to virtual, then that conversational style is even more emphasized because we can use our voices as conversationally as possibly. We can whisper, people can hear us. And so we can do things with our persona, the way we use our instrument of our body, our voice, and our nonverbal communication in a way that in some respect is as close to sitting across the table with someone as possible, even though we're missing all those nonverbal cues that, of course, we pick up on when we are across the room from somebody.
I never thought about the fact that when you're online, you can whisper and you're still being heard. And of course, we do that automatically. We just don't think about it. Yeah. Right. But certainly on stage, you don't do that. Well, I've worked with a lot of executives, especially when they in the arena of helping them tell their story better, because I've done a lot of work in storytelling, as you know. And one of the things they really get nervous about is, I don't know how to tell a story, Madelyn. I'm going to be awful. And you have to put them at ease, because once you put them at ease, it doesn't matter if they make a few mistakes. But what I tell them is, just be who you are. Be your authentic self. Well, that's part of the title of our session today. So why don't we talk a little bit about how you see this thing called the authentic self?
Sure. One way to think about this question of authenticity is through the lens of trust. Because if someone is not authentic with us, we sense that they perhaps aren't someone who we deem trustworthy. And so I think that's a reasonably helpful vantage point for starting to think about authenticity, is not just about what I feel is my authentic self, but I'm trying to talk to an audience and I want them to trust me, because if I didn't want them to trust me, I must have some very unusual goals for persuasion or influence. But trust is almost implicit in what a speaker is trying to convey in almost any persuasive setting. And if someone seems like they're putting on an act, i.e. inauthentic, then it's going to be very hard to trust them. And so I think that in some way, when you approach the question of what is the authentic me, what you're really asking is, what is the me that is going to seem most natural to someone, so that it's not going to perhaps raise questions that will have someone question my trustworthiness. So that's one way to approach it. And let me put another thing on the table around trust. Another thing that we're, of course, trying to do is demonstrate that we're credible. So trust is one half of the game, credibility is the other. And this goes back to really the beginning of communications as a discipline. There was a seminal paper written really when communication as an academic discipline was first founded. It said credibility and trust. These are the essentials of sort of solid communication, persuasive communication. And the question of how you demonstrate capability, how you demonstrate trust, in some way that is at the foundation of the method that I've always tried to bring to my work with clients. And I think that authenticity really does speak to that question of trust most specifically.
You know, I find that useful in many ways. For example, to me, if I talk to them about trust, and I love that connection there, a person who is speaking actually can begin to sense whether the audience is trusting them. Whether it's nods, it's smiles, it's all kinds of clues and cues come back to you as a speaker if you're really observant of your audience. And of course, you shouldn't be speaking if you don't know your audience. And so it gives them a measure, so to speak, and an affirmation. Hey, I'm moving in the right direction here. Yeah, thank you. That's a great tool there. And of course, credible, I do agree. Today, that's remarkably important, shall we say. Whoops, I just realized I didn't turn my phone off, so I'm just going to now turn it off so we don't hear those little interrupts. I have a guest who is arriving at my home, and I'm very excited that she's going to be coming. So now I know she's on her way. All right, be that as it may, let's come back. We just talked now about trust, and for me, that was a help in terms of how I will help people. But how do you help people present their authentic self in addition to what we've said?
Well, it's all about approaching people as individuals at the most fundamental level. Everyone, in some way, approaches this from their own unique strengths, their own unique vantage point. And part of the question I ask is, using those two pillars around credibility and trust, I ask, how is this person demonstrating to their audience that they're capable, that they know their stuff, let's say? You know, for instance, you were talking about working with economists. Economists tend to be very good at demonstrating their subject matter expertise or showing us that they have that. And that's part of the equation. That's the credibility side. But then the question on the other side is, how do you connect with that audience? Maybe that audience isn't all PhD economists and they need to be able to understand what you're talking about. So how do you connect by showing the audience that you understand what matters to them? Not just that you've got all this expertise, but that you can imagine what their potential knowledge of this might be, what their interests in it are. And then there's also what you think they might need to know that they don't know, not in a presumptuous way, but in the sense that you're there to share something with them that's unfamiliar. And at that point, some people are better at showing that expertise, and some people are really good at the connecting. And I find that this is almost like being right-handed or being left-handed. And there's nothing right or wrong about having one of those being your preferred set of muscles. But like the right-handed, left-handed analogy, it doesn't mean that hand that's not your dominant hand is completely uncoordinated. You have to be able to use both of them and ideally use them together. So showing people some of that sense of, yes, I'm capable, I've got expertise, I'm a little assertive about my expertise, and I understand what matters to you. And so I'm going to start by framing my expertise through a lens that both resonates with you and also that shows you that I'm cognizant of your concerns, your interests, even your emotions about whatever we're talking about.
I'm going to challenge you.
Go ahead.
I described that situation since you mentioned The Economist. I'd love to know your thoughts as to why that worked or appeared to work.
Well, I think it probably worked because you gave them some attention in this area that they probably not had attention in the past. Quite honestly, if there's one thing that makes people better at speaking in public or in any kind of a persuasive forum, it's simply practicing. And getting feedback from an honest broker is just going to make you better than if you don't get feedback. I mean, barring somebody giving you incredibly damaging feedback, which you would never do, of course. So I think that simply having the opportunity and the space, a safe space to practice like that, is one of the best things that anyone can do to get better at this. And
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, they never presented anything to me because we didn't have time for that. Right. All we had time for was, why do you want to do this? What is it you're trying to accomplish in this? And I kept asking the question. And it was funny because they'd look at me like, why are you asking me the same question again? But in the end, every one of them finally said, okay, this, and what they were saying basically was, this is how I will measure my success at the moment.
Right. So, well, you focused them. I think that that's a tremendous thing. If you keep people focused on what they're trying to accomplish, I think that's a terrific way to approach this, especially given the time constraints that you had with them. Mm-hmm. I think that was very shrewd.
Well, one has to be very practical, as you're helping people, because I'm very much of the opinion that as an advisor to someone, you must never do harm. I mean, we're like doctors. You must never do harm to that psyche in there that's trying hard to be better. And so that's always I'll call it my constraint. It'd be very easy to blast, but that's not what is going to, as you say, it's not going to be helpful.
First do no harm was actually always written in the coaching philosophy of our firm from when we started. We actually sat down when we were getting going. We said, what is our coaching philosophy? And that was the very first sentence when it said, first do no harm. And we were very cognizant of the idea that can be a really counterproductive thing if somebody gives you feedback that you can't hear, or it's poorly delivered, or it's just flat out wrong. And any of us who are in the advice giving business have to be humble about the fact that we don't know everything. Yeah. And even if we have expertise in a certain area, we don't have all of the facts or all of the context or all of the story. And there are 100 reasons that the advice we're giving might need to be recalibrated in some way.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your firm. Why don't you take a minute and talk about what it is that you do?
Yeah, at the highest level, what we do is we really just focus on this question of people being good at speaking. And that could be in meetings, it could be on television, it could be in debates. It's really about people conversing and or delivering messages. So we don't, for instance, you don't call us for a full strategy communications firm that will do your website and all these other kinds of things that a more traditional strategic communications firm might do. We focus on live communication and getting people to be compelling speakers or effective speakers in the widest range of settings. And that, like I said, can vary from individuals speaking in meetings to big conference events and live television and sort of glitzy settings. Yeah, everything from the mundane to the fantastic. Mm-hmm.
I remember one time I sat in a session where we were being coached for this kind of thing. And I'll never forget, they said, you were supposed to say 1, 2, 3, 4 to the audience. Well, of course, all of us said, oh, how do I do this? And I went 1, 2. And of course, I immediately said to me, do not point your fingers at the audience. I don't think I ever forgot that, but I'm not sure that my body remembers that because I like to use my hands.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I'm of the school of thought that gesturing, if you're a gesturer, you need to gesture or your energy is going to get bottled up and you're not going to be as effective as a speaker. I've heard that there are some people specifically in the media training space who say, sit on your hands. To me, that's just plain terrible advice. Because if somebody needs to express their energy, they better find a way to do that is both authentic to them, to use the word we started with here, and that doesn't distract their audience. That's the fundamental question around authenticity that I think is challenging. So let's say it was my authentic habit to just scratch my neck while we were talking. And I started doing this while we were talking. And every few seconds I did this because that's just how I felt. Well, that might be pretty distracting to you and the audience here. And so I think that when we talk about what it means to coach someone around this question of authenticity, it is challenging because, at some extreme, our authentic self might be us, eating Doritos on the couch. And that might not be the person that we're going to bring to a public setting in which we're trying to persuade people. And so I make this point about behaviors that might be distracting or in some way take people away from what you're trying to do in your communication with them, and trying to build new habit around that is really challenging. And the way I approach this is it's always about a choice you have as a speaker. A lot of this is around normative behavior. A lot of it's around social constructs around what is considered appropriate behavior in this setting or that setting. And a lot of those things are shifting as stereotype awareness shifts, as lots of different things shift. So I do think that this idea that there is no right way to do any of this. It's about choices that individuals have as speakers. And you get to decide whether you're going to reject norms around this or whether you're going to embrace them in some way. I think that's an important conversation to have with people about this. And like I said, where there are things that are repetitive behaviors that are distracting for people in some way, I will certainly point those out to folks. But ultimately, it's their choice if they want to address something or if they want to say, you know what, this is my style. That's my thing. That's what I do. So I think that we have to be open-minded as we talk about giving advice to people about things that are incredibly personal and really hard for people. It goes down to the deepest essence of how we behave, and it's very habit driven. And none of it changes in an hour with somebody or a day or even a month.
That's a very good point. It's habit driven. And that was what I faced with these economists. I knew they had habits of presenting, and I knew that I could not get in front of those habits by giving them several things to do. One they could do, they could think of occasionally. And so that was another part of my strategy there. That was probably one of the most gratifying of my engagements, and I've had many, but that one was fun and unexpected. Well, you've been talking about a lot of this stuff about this authentic self and how you deal with it from your company. Are there things specific that you have learned? I know you've shared some of this, but is there something you've learned for yourself or met as you've done this work?
There are lots of things. First off, I was not what you might call a compelling presenter of myself when I started this work. So I'm my own test case. Anything you see me doing that you might deem effective here is learned behavior. And so I really am a huge believer that people can learn to communicate more effectively. And I do think that, just like athletic ability or musical ability, all of us have a certain range where we're better at some things than others. That's natural. And I think speaking ability to a certain extent, or speaking in front of others to a certain extent, that's one of those abilities that has some range like that. Foreign language is another one. The ability to learn foreign languages is something some people have more facility than others. That said, anyone can get better at this through practice. And so for me, a lot of this has been taking my own medicine, essentially. And I would never ask a client to do anything I wouldn't do as someone who has learned to be a better public speaker. And I think that in some way, I'm always learning from this. I just see this as a continuous learning process. And the folks who I co-founded KNP with years ago, we're still trading articles with each other about things we read in the research and things that are happening in the news around people who are effective speakers or who we find particularly impressive or depressing for one reason or another, as far as either their delivery style or their approach or their resonance with audiences.
You know, one of the things that occurred to me as you were talking about changing habits and that sort of thing, I studied under a wonderful coach myself for about 5 years. And he always emphasized the fact that, you know, on stage is 5 minutes or an hour or whatever. But what comes before that is huge. He said, rehearse, 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 rehearse. And that's what was going through my head. And when you said that, I thought this is still running true from his instruction to yours. The other thing I wanted to tack on, I loved your point about the scratching, and that necessarily is not appropriate because it didn't fit the content. It's sort of like watching a movie that has a plot with violence in it just for the sake of violence. And it just really bothers me. I don't need that. I like the plot as it is, the story as it is. The other day I watched a whole series where there were periodic moments of violence, but it was absolutely appropriate. You had to have that as part of the plot. And that's what I'm thinking now in terms of whatever you bring to the talk in terms of physicality has got to fit the content. Does that make sense?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. One way that I talk to clients about this is I suggest that our visual cues, that is to say gestures and body language, have to align with what you're saying. And when we see a lack of alignment, that's one of the things that elicits a sense of perhaps mistrust. It might not be a front of the brain thought, but it might be just a little subconscious thing where we sense that something's a little off. I mean, if I had come on with you this morning, this afternoon, and said, "Yeah, great to be here." Well, I said the words "great to be here," so
I didn't believe you.
right. But you know, that's the point, is when there's a lack of alignment between the words and the visual, we trust the visual. And one great way to practice this for yourself, any of us can do this these days, is you can open a little Zoom meeting by yourself and hit record and say something for a few minutes that you've wanted to say, and you're recording, watch it back and turn the sound off and ask yourself, what does it look like this person is saying? Ask it almost like you're a scientist watching yourself, saying, what does it look like this person is feeling at this moment in time or that moment in time? Then turn the sound on and see what it was you were actually saying there, and see if there's alignment or disconnect there. It's a really interesting exercise, and it's something I certainly have done for years with clients to try to give them a sense of how these cues are either amplifying their message or undercutting it in some way.
I love that advice. In fact, one of the things that I did as part of my practice was to watch movies with the sound off. I mean, just the reverse. And it was like, wow, you really could follow, because the actors obviously are trained to do precisely that. Right. Well, I'm just enjoying this talk so much, Matt. I have to tell you.
Me too.
I want to get into your book, This Compelling People. You talked about not just trust, but also credibility. And I'd like to have you do an expansion on that. But we're going to take a break right now. When we come back, Matt, I'm going to pose that question to you. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back. As soon as I get my cursor, there it is. I'm my own technician, I have to tell you. Welcome back. You've been listening to Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair. And today we've been talking with Matt Kohut, and we've been talking about what it takes to be, I guess I'll say, just to be a really effective presenter of your ideas, whether you're on stage or across the table, wherever it is. And I asked Matt if he would expand a bit on his book called Compelling People. Matt?
So the fundamental idea of compelling people is based in something called social judgment theory. And I want to give credit to the folks whose work was the most fundamental to that in the work that my co-author John Neffinger and I did. We were really popularizing some ideas that were laid out in a paper by Susan Fiske at Princeton, Amy Cuddy at Harvard Business School, and Peter Glick at Lawrence University. And what they called social judgment theory posited that there are two fundamental judgments that people make about each other that account for about 80% of all of the judgments we make about each other. One of them is what John and I called a strength judgment. The research called it a competence judgment, but we thought it was a little bit more than just competence. Competence speaks to skill. We thought it was more skill plus will. And I've taken to calling it a capability judgment since then. It trips people up less than strength does, which has some cultural dimensions to it that can be problematic. The other judgment is a warmth judgment. I've taken to calling this a connection judgment for the same reason, because cultural connotations of warmth can complicate the discussion. And this idea that strength, warmth, or capability, connection, competence, warmth, these two things are in tension with each other, because the things that make you seem incredibly capable can also make you seem really almost distant and aloof. And on the flip side, if you seem like you are all warmth and really no capability, then you can seem like a pleasant pushover. And so all of us, since we were kids on the playground, have in some way figured out the way we balance these things. Like I said, these are sets of muscles, and most of us prefer one set over the other as our first move. But the question is, as adults, where we find ourselves in life, wherever we are, we have choices about how we amplify or recalibrate that balance. And that, in some big picture way, is what Compelling People tried to address.
What I so appreciate about this and what you've said is that it's not 17 things I have to keep in my head at one time. It's just a couple.
Right.
And I can choose to work on one, only one, if that's where I feel the need is. But still, it's only two. And I just really value that. I sometimes think we overburden ourselves with long lists of to-dos and You know, I'm always astounded when I read down the names of blogs, you know, the 10 things that smart people do. I just get tired of that. But anyway, so 2 is really great.
Well, this has a long history too. I mean, Machiavelli famously asked, is it better to be feared or loved? And when you think about this idea
Mm,
of strength without warmth, that's
yeah,
fear. And loved is warmth, is the sort of extreme of warmth or that sense of connection with someone. So the idea of these two fundamental qualities in tension has been identified and in some way quantified by social science in recent decades, but it's a really old idea in our culture, and I think, and even cross-culturally. So I think that in some way we've now put it in a context of social science that speaks to our norms today around what is considered legitimate and valid. But I think that people have known this in our bones as humans for a long, long
for a
time.
long time. Oh, great. There's nothing new under the sun, huh?
That's right.
uh, you know, oftentimes I'm working with people, especially young people, where they're early in their careers, but they're serious about their careers. And actually, I say young people, and yet I've worked with people in their 40s and 50s as well. Uh, how do you advise them when they're trying to show their capabilities? I love that word, capabilities. Uh, and I'm thinking particularly of women who oftentimes are considered to be show off, as they try to show people they really can do things. What are some thoughts that you have on that?
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up. One of the reasons that Fisk, Cuddy, and Glick wrote this paper was they were looking at cultural stereotypes in workplaces.
Mm.
And gender stereotypes were very prominent. They figured very prominently in their work there. And you just talked to a very specific one that has become pretty well known in the past decade or so, I would say, but it still bears worth, it's worth just digging into a little bit. There are cultural presumptions. I'm just speaking in the U.S. American culture here for a second about cultural presumptions around this sense of capability and connection. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that men are presumed to be capable. And this speaks to, I mentioned this word strength before. There are presumptions that men are going to demonstrate capability. And the thing that men get dinged for, as far as stereotype, is our shows of weakness. Mm-hmm. Now, men are allowed to be warm and connect with people, but the weakness is the thing that gets them in trouble, so to speak. Yeah. Women are expected to be warmer than men. And as you just said, then when women show capability, there's something that researchers like Amy Cuddy and Susan Fisk have deemed a warmth penalty. And this is something that's been, like I said, written about widely. And it's a double standard. Let's just be really clear about that. We're talking about something that's a straight up cultural stereotype double standard. And what you see among women who are really effective public communicators, I'm just going to limit it to that narrow domain there because it's hard to generalize otherwise, is that the women who do this really well, who don't in any way compromise that sense of capability, they don't turn the dial down on capability, they turn the dial up on that sense of connection. So they know, they're cognizant of this. Believe me, they knew this long before they heard anything from a joker like me about this. They didn't have to read my book to know about this. They knew about this from lived experience. And they figured out strategies to, in some way, navigate this stereotype by not rolling back their capability, but turning up that sense of connection to rebalance for it in some way. Is this unfair? Absolutely. And yet, when you look at really effective women leaders in the public sphere, at least here in the United States, you see this incredible sense of connection that they're able to demonstrate with people, where people feel like they are sharing that sense of concerns, interests, and even emotions while maintaining that sense of incredible capability.
You know, as you were talking, I was thinking of one time I was interviewing some executive, and
who do you want to send it to?
Excuse me. There's my that now it's Siri talking. Now, why is she talking to me? I was interviewing this executive, and it was a very serious topic. And, and I just was asking the questions. And he looks at me and says, "Couldn't you smile?" And I thought, no, okay, I can smile. I have no problem smiling. But I thought, darn, that's what he's waiting for. It's what he's looking for in me. So that was an early lesson that I had to do some balancing, even when I was working on something serious.
You know, I'm so glad you brought that specific cue up, because it's something that I hear again and again from women leaders who are clients. They get told things like this in feedback sessions with people they work for. I think this is the most incredibly harmful kind of feedback. And we were talking about do no harm. Well, let me offer those of you listening a tip here. If you're going to tell somebody you should smile more, you're doing harm. That's not helpful advice to somebody, especially to women, knowing that this stereotype is sort of front and center in our public way of relating. And you know, the research on this is conflicted and troubling in that women do tend to smile more, and women are expected to smile more. And it's that expectation that you were being informed about in this not so pleasant way. And as a result of this, I think part of what I'm seeing in my work is generationally, I'm talking to millennial leaders, millennial women, Gen Z women, and they're just saying no to this. They're just not even in any way responding to this affirmatively. And I am right there with them in that sense. You know, the last thing I'm going to do is say you should smile more. What I do think is interesting to think about is some people are warmer than others. Some people show connection better than others. Some people show capability better than others. And I do think it is important for all of us to think about, how am I showing the people I'm talking to my sense of connection to them, to their concerns, to their interests. There are lots of different ways to do that that don't include smiling. And the question, I think, is then to think, okay, maybe I'm not a naturally smiley person. Maybe I'm an introvert. Maybe it's cultural. Maybe it's my personality. There are all kinds of reasons that we prefer one set of cues over another. The question that we can explore is, how are you going to show your audience that you understand their concerns and their interests or their emotions? And what's going to do that authentically for you? So that brings us back to that authentic word.
Yes, that authentic word. You know, one of the things that I recommend to people and advise in my book to help them develop their resilience is to actually discover who they are. Because the more confident you are, the better you know yourself, the more confident you become, because you know what you're bringing to the table and you feel good about that. And one of the ways I do that is I say every day, think of a story and write down a story from your own life. And it can be from 5 minutes ago or when you were 5, but that doesn't matter. The point is to have that constant attention of instances in your life. It's incredibly effective when I'm working with leaders who don't seem to be able to convey what they want to convey in a meeting. And I say, okay, now just afterwards, tell a story about that meeting. What did you do? What did other people do? And it's amazing how they discover about themselves and about their staff, which is another interesting side benefit, shall we say. Do you start from somewhere else, or do you just not worry about whether they know their authentic self?
You know, I don't spend too much time figuring. I don't start from that, I guess. I figure that out reasonably quickly based on our conversation, based on what I see in somebody presenting, whether it's on video or maybe they're doing a little simulation for me. And through conversation, some people have greater self-awareness than others. And you meet people where they are and you make triage decisions about how much time you have with them, like you did with the economists, and what you can get done with somebody given what seems to be their level of emotional self-awareness. and the ability to work with them over time or not. And then you triangulate from there. And so it's a lot of judgment calls based on all those factors. There's not one way, I guess I would say.
I always love to hear that there's not one way.
Yeah, I'm very much a fox and not a hedgehog.
I'm hearing a lot of specific things that people can do. Certainly observe themselves, record themselves in a Zoom call. I love that idea. I've done that myself. It's a convenient way to create a little video, and then you can toss it if you want to. What are some other things that you advise people that they could just begin for themselves to get themselves where they can be more effective?
Well, one thing that I think is helpful, especially if you are in an underrepresented group, is to say, okay, look, there may be nobody in my organization who looks like me, who expresses themselves like me. And so look adjacently, look at video of people who maybe are more like you outside of your organization, and try and find exemplars in some way who can be role models from afar, from whom you might nip a trick or two, or think, I like the way she does that. Maybe that might help me in some way with the challenge I'm having. And I think that, one of the benefits of the world of YouTube is that we can access leaders we would previously have had no access to a couple decades ago. And so we can look at someone who we're never going to have a chance to meet in person and say, wow, I love the way she did that. I love the way he did this. And think about, could I learn something from that person that I might find useful? So I think that there's a little bit of exploration that can go on here. And it's fun too, quite honestly, because you can look at lots of different people and say, yeah, not for me. Oh, that's cool. That resonates with me.
You're right. Absolutely right. That today we have so many more options. In the past, the best you could do would be to watch movies, but even those, are concocted.
Right.
So that whereas if you're watching someone who is just giving a presentation, okay, a certain amount of that might be rehearsed, but still it's a real thing. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. And I love the idea of looking for adjacent exemplars. I think that was one of the real challenges, I'll say, in the 70s and 80s for women. There were no exemplars. Now there are exemplars that you can readily find.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been a real benefit. That was actually one of my big objectives, was to be the best I could be, so that younger women could see someone who had. I was a division chief at the World Bank, so I was in that kind of a position where they could observe and see that what worked and what didn't work. Of course, that's a whole story in itself, as all those things are. Well, I can't believe we have almost chased this hour to the end, but we still have some time, not completely to the end. I'm thoroughly enjoying this, I have to say. Is there anything that I haven't asked you, or that you want to ask me, that because we still have a little bit of time?
Well, I would love to know the way you see yourself as a communicator. So we've been talking about this sense of demonstrating your capability, demonstrating your connection. Which of those do you think you lead with? And how would you describe yourself as a communicator?
Oh, gosh. Well, I know that I am now, and I will tell you that this is the feedback that I get, that when I am even just here on a little square on the computer, that apparently I project a lot of power. And so for me, I am always conscious of that, so that when I speak, I make sure that I put forward my genuine appreciation for the audience. And that's the best way for me to say it, because otherwise it would be concocted. to just simply say, I'm just so happy that they are there, that there's people out there watching us today, that you're being willing to talk to me. I remind myself of that. And so I try to project that to balance out what I'm told I come across as very powerful. So does that answer your question?
It does. And I think that's right. At a first glance, you do come across as someone who really puts your capability right there on the block for us to see. And so I think you answered it really well. And I think it's a really good read, a good self-analysis at the first cut here. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I've been working on this for a while.
Right. I would be surprised if you didn't have a pretty good sense of this after all this time doing this. Sure.
Yeah. And, it's funny. The honing of this has occurred during these live sessions. I mean, I've been working live on either radio or TV for about 3 years. And it's just amazing how you just become more conscious of all the pieces that make this really work. And you fortunately get feedback from people that say this or that. So, well, thank you for that question. That was exciting even for me to explore it, to try to articulate it. Because, normally you do things, but you don't necessarily articulate it. So it's very, very helpful.
I do have one last thought if we have a second.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. And it's around the importance of context. And where communication is concerned, context is king.
Yeah.
And none of the stuff we've been talking about happens in a vacuum. It all happens in this context or that context. And a person who seems incredibly capable in one context may be the least capable person in another one. And so I think it's just worth remembering that none of us shows up exactly the same way in all the different places we have to show up, whether it's professionally, personally, or some combination of the two. And it's always worth taking this for granted. I've been talking about this sense of capability and connection, like you dial this up once and that's who you are at some fixed point in time. And that's really not true for any of us. We show up differently with different clients. Those of us who are in the professional services world do. And, similarly in our interactions with people we see outside of our professional lives. So I just can't overemphasize the importance of accounting for context when you're thinking about these judgments.
Excellent point. And it was really in my notes for us to talk about that. So I'm so happy that you brought it up, Matt. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you had to move some things on your schedule to be with me, and I so appreciate that. And I'm sure that my audience does as well. So thank you again.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, welcome. All right. Let's see. This week's topic came actually from a lot of discussions that I've had with so many leaders. You may have a topic that you would like to hear more about here at Unlocked. If you have a topic, write to me at madelyn@madelynblair.com. It's in the bottom of the screen, but if you're listening to this, instead it's MADELYN @madelynblair.com. I love hearing from you, and I will read your emails. I will respond to your emails. And if I use your topic, you will receive a copy of my book, Essays in Two Voices. It's being used by couples and by companies across 4 continents. Next week, we'll be talking with Laura Sim. She's the partner and VP Portfolio Management of Teleo Project Services. She's the co-host of the Mission Driven Leader podcast. She describes herself as a stepping stone that helps others become their best. And we'll be talking about women in project management. So be sure to put it on your calendar and join us on March 30th at noon Eastern here on E360 TV. Thank you for listening to this segment of Unlocked. Be sure to comment on social media about the show and what you gained from it. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, the archives are available at madelynblair.com/media. And if you haven't done so, check out my book, Unlocked, on Amazon. Thank you for watching Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.